On a gray morning in October of 2019, every farmer in Hardin County, Iowa, looked out at fields that had been stripped flat by a storm that moved through in the night. Not a wind event anyone had predicted. Not a named storm. Just 40 miles an hour of sustained pressure arriving from the northwest at the worst possible hour, when the wheat was tall and heavy, and the stems had been softened by 3 weeks of wet weather. By 6 in the morning, the calls had started coming into the county extension office. By 8, the grain elevator in Eldora had a line of trucks waiting, and the men sitting in those trucks were not talking. They were doing the math in their heads, and the math was not good. Let me tell you about Hardin County in the fall of 2019, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what happened there. Hardin County sits in the middle of Iowa like a postage stamp pressed flat by a giant hand. The land is dark and rich and almost perfectly level, and for as long as anyone could remember, the farmers there had grown winter wheat. Not because someone decided it, not because a committee voted on it, because their fathers had grown it, and their fathers' fathers had grown it, and the soil and the climate and the infrastructure of the county, the elevators, the dealers, the agronomists, the equipment, had all been built around that one fact. Winter wheat in Hardin County was not a crop. It was a condition of existence. The farms ran anywhere from 200 to 800 acres. Most families had been on their ground for 3 or 4 generations. The yields were consistent, sometimes excellent, occasionally disappointing, but never catastrophic, or so the record showed. 11 bushels per acre above the state average over the previous decade. The elevator in Eldora moved more winter wheat tonnage per square mile of county than any other facility in the state. The county extension agent, a man named Dale Crowley, had worked that territory for 19 years and knew every farm by its soil type and drainage pattern. He was not a bad man. He was a thorough man. He had seen a lot of winters and a lot of harvests, and he had built his understanding of what worked and what didn't on the evidence of those seasons, and that understanding had served him reasonably well, and he saw no reason to question it. That is not a criticism of Dale Crowley. That is a description of how tradition works. It does not announce itself as tradition. It announces itself as common sense. Let me tell you about the Tesdall farm, because the Tesdall farm is where this story begins and where it ends. Harlan Tesdall had farmed 480 acres on the east side of Hardin County for 31 years. He was methodical and careful and not given to experiment. He kept his equipment maintained and his records clean, and his relationships with the elevator and the co-op easy and professional. He planted winter wheat in October and harvested it in July and did it again the following year, and the year after that, and the year after that, and his yields tracked the county average so closely that if you graphed them together, you could barely see the gap. He was, in the language of the county, a good farmer. That was the highest compliment available, and he had earned it, and he wore it without ceremony. His daughter's name was Nora. Nora Tesdall was 22 years old in the spring of 2019, and she had just finished her junior year at Iowa State University in Ames, studying agronomy. She had grown up on that farm. She had driven the grain cart at age 12 and helped her father pull soil samples at 14, and spent 2 summers working for a seed company in the summers between high school and college. She was not a stranger to farming, but she had spent 3 years being taught by people who studied farming the way scientists study anything, with controlled trials and published data, and a willingness to question what everyone assumed was settled. That combination, the farm girl and the research university, had produced something that made her different from most of the people she would come home to. She had learned to ask why. Let me tell you about the spring of 2019, because that is when the conversation happened that set everything in motion. Nora came home for a long weekend in April, and on the second evening she was there. She sat down at the kitchen table after dinner with a manila folder and a yellow legal pad covered in her handwriting. Her father was still at the table. Her mother, a woman named Diane, was at the counter with a dish towel. Nora opened the folder and put it on the table between herself and her father, and said quietly that she wanted to talk about the fall planting. Harlan looked at the papers in the folder. There were tables of numbers and a few printed pages from what looked like journal articles. He did not pick them up. He said, without hostility, that he had already ordered his seed. Nora said she knew that. She said she wasn't asking him to change his whole operation. She was asking him to consider planting oats with the wheat on 30 acres of the south field, the ground near the creek that ran wet in the spring and had been his lowest yielding block for the last 6 years. She said she wanted to try a mixed stand. Winter wheat and oats seeded together at adjusted rates. The way some farmers in northern Europe had been doing it for decades, and the way a handful of researchers at Iowa State and at Wageningen University in the Netherlands had been studying and replicated trials since 2014. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does that do?" Nora turned the legal pad so he could see it. She said, "Let me tell you about the science, because the science is the reason I'm sitting here asking you this instead of just waiting until I have my own farm. Let me tell you about the science, because it matters, and because Nora had spent the better part of 2 semesters understanding it well enough to explain it at a kitchen table in Hardin County, Iowa, without a single slide or a single piece of jargon her father couldn't follow. Winter wheat is a tall plant. In a good year, in a wet spring, it can reach 36 to 40 inches by the time the heads are full and heavy. The problem with a tall plant carrying a heavy head is structural. The stem, the culm, in botanical terms, has to support that weight through wind events and rain, and the simple physics of a heavy object on a long lever arm. When the stem weakens, which it does in wet conditions because the cell walls take up water and lose rigidity, the plant falls over. Farmers call it lodging. A lodged crop is a nightmare. The heads touch the ground. They mold. The combine can't pick them up cleanly. You lose yield. You lose quality. You lose money. The researchers at Wageningen had been looking at a specific question. What happens to a wheat stand's resistance to lodging when you introduce a companion crop? Specifically oats at planting. The oats germinate faster than the wheat. They establish a canopy earlier. They grow at a different rate and to a different height, and they create what the researchers called a mechanical support matrix. Essentially, a living scaffold that the wheat stems lean against and are partially supported by when wind or rain loads the canopy. The oats also compete with weeds more aggressively in the early season, reducing the weed pressure on the wheat. They fix nothing in the soil. Oats are not a legume, but they change the physical architecture of the stand in ways that reduce lodging risk substantially. The Iowa State trials, which Nora's professor, a man named Dr. Paul Hendricks, had been running since 2016 on research plots in Story County, showed a 34% reduction in lodging incidence in mixed wheat-oat stands compared to pure wheat stands across 3 seasons. The yield penalty for the wheat in the mixed stand was small, between 4 and 7% in most trials. But the oat yield from the same ground added revenue that more than compensated for it. In the 2 seasons where a significant wind event occurred during the grain fill period, the mixed stands outperformed the pure wheat stands in net revenue per acre by an average of $47. In the 1 season where no significant wind event occurred, The pure wheat stands outperformed the mixed stands by $12 per acre. The math, Nora said, was not complicated. You were buying insurance. The premium was small. The payout, in a bad year, was substantial. Harlan sat with that for a while. He looked at the tables. He was a man who understood numbers, and he could see that the numbers were not fabricated, and he could follow the logic. But he had farmed 480 acres for 31 years, and he had never planted oats with his wheat, and neither had his father, and neither had anyone else in the county that he knew of. And there was a weight to that fact that the numbers on a yellow legal pad could not simply lift away. He said, "I need to think about it." Diane, at the counter, said quietly without turning around, "She's right, you know." Harlan looked at his wife's back. He looked at his daughter. He said, 30 acres. The south field by the creek. And if the yields come in wrong, we talk about it before you do anything else. Nora said that was fair. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the laugh. Dale Crowley had been the county extension agent for Hardin County since 2000. He had a bachelor's degree in agronomy from Iowa State and a master's in extension education from the University of Wisconsin, and he had spent nearly 2 decades building relationships with the farmers of that county that were, in his view, the most valuable professional asset he possessed. He knew their soils. He knew their rotations. He knew which families were careful and which were careless, and which were going through hard times and needed a quiet word, and which were doing well and didn't need anything from him but a handshake at the co-op. He was respected. He held court, as they said, at the Hardin County Co-op on the second Tuesday of every month, when the farmers came in to settle accounts and pick up supplies and stand around the counter talking about the weather and the markets and whatever was on their minds. It was an informal thing, but it was also, in the way of small communities, a kind of institution. Nora Tesdall came into the co-op on a Tuesday morning in late May of 2019, 3 weeks before she was due back in Ames for summer coursework. She had her father's permission to plant the 30 acres, and she had the seed ordered, and she had stopped in to pick up a soil amendment her father had asked for. Dale Crowley was at the counter with 2 other farmers, Bud Harrington and Gene Vandermeer, both of whom had been farming in the county for longer than Nora had been alive. Dale asked how Harlan was doing. Nora said he was fine. Dale asked if she was back for the summer. Nora said just a few weeks. Dale said that was too bad. The county could use more young people who knew which end of a tractor to start from. It was a compliment, delivered with the easy warmth of a man who was comfortable in his authority, and Nora accepted it as such. Then she mentioned, without particular drama, that she was going to be putting in a mixed wheat-oat stand on 30 acres of the south field before she went back. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale Crowley started laughing. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside his frame of reference that his first response is amusement rather than argument. Bud Harrington smiled. Gene Vandermeer looked at his boots. Dale said, "Mixed stand." He said it the way you might say perpetual motion machine. He said, "Honey, this is a wheat county. Has been since before your grandfather was born. You put oats in with your wheat. You're going to confuse your combine operator and cut your yield and explain yourself to your father at harvest time." Nora said, "The trials at Iowa State showed a 34% reduction in lodging incidents and a net revenue advantage of $47 per acre in wind event seasons." Dale said, "Trials." He said it with a particular inflection that made it clear he considered trials conducted by university researchers on research plots to be a category of information distinct from and inferior to, the knowledge accumulated by 19 years of walking actual farm ground in actual conditions. He said, "You know what I've never seen in 19 years? A Hardin County farmer who needed oats to prop up his wheat." He said, "Your father's a good farmer. Plant his wheat. Let the oats go." Bud Harrington nodded. Gene Vandermeer continued to study his boots. Norris said, "I appreciate the advice." She picked up her father's soil amendment and walked out. "Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When Dale Crowley laughed that morning, what was he protecting? He was not protecting his farmers. He was not protecting the county's yields. He was protecting a model of knowledge that had served him well for 19 years, and that he had no reason, from inside his own experience, to question. He was protecting the idea that the ground teaches you more than the university does, which is sometimes true, and sometimes the most dangerous thing a smart person can believe. He was protecting, without knowing it, the assumption that because something bad had not happened yet, it could not happen. And that assumption, in farming, has a way of collecting a debt that it presents without warning. The South Field got planted in October of 2019. 30 acres of mixed winter wheat and oats, seeded at adjusted rates that Nora had worked out with Dr. Hendricks before she went back to Ames. The rest of the farm, 450 acres, went in as pure winter wheat, the way it always had. Harlan did not tell anyone at the co-op what his daughter had talked him into. He was not embarrassed by it, exactly, but he was also not prepared to defend it in public, and in a county where everyone knew everyone's business. The easiest way to avoid a conversation was to not start one. The winter came and went. The wheat emerged in the fall and went dormant under the snow and broke dormancy in March, the way it always did. And by May, the fields were green and the heads were beginning to form, and everything looked, to the untrained eye, exactly the way it always looked. The difference was visible if you walked the south field and looked carefully. The stand there was denser, and the texture of it was different. The oat plants were slightly shorter than the wheat, and they grew in between the wheat stems in a way that gave the whole stand a kind of interlocking quality, a woven look that the pure wheat fields didn't have. Harlan walked it twice in May and said nothing to Nora about what he saw, but he called her on a Sunday evening and asked how the oat plants should be looking at that stage, and she told him, and he said, "That's what they look like." Let me tell you about the storm that came through Hardin County on the night of October 14th, 2019, because that storm is the reason this story is still being told. It arrived from the northwest at approximately 11 in the evening. The forecast had called for winds of 15 to 20 miles an hour, with a chance of gusts to 25. What arrived was 40 miles an hour sustained, with gusts to 53, for a period of approximately 4 hours between 11 at night and 3 in the morning. The wheat in Hardin County was at a stage that agronomists call late grain fill. The heads were heavy with grain that had not yet fully hardened, and the stems had been softened by 3 consecutive weeks of above-average rainfall. It was, in the language of crop science, a perfect lodging scenario. High canopy load, compromised stem integrity, sustained lateral force. By 3 in the morning, the storm had passed. By 6, when the first farmers were walking their fields in the gray light, the extent of the damage was becoming clear. The pure wheat stands, which was nearly every field in the county, had lodged. Not partially, not in the low spots or the wet corners. Across entire fields, in some cases, the wheat had gone down. Stems bent at the base, heads touching or nearly touching the soil, the whole canopy flattened in the direction the wind had come from, like a field that had been combed. The visual was striking and sickening in equal measure. Harlan Tesdall walked his north field at first light and stood at the end of a row and looked at 200 acres of lodged wheat and felt the specific cold dread of a man who has just watched a year's work fall down. Then he drove to the south field. The south field was not standing perfectly. There was some lodging in the corners, where the field met the tree line and the wind had eddied and concentrated. But the body of the field, the 22 or 23 acres at the center, where the stand was densest and the oat plants were most evenly distributed, was standing. Not upright in the way a field looks in a calm June morning, but substantially upright. The wheat stems were leaning, some of them, but they were leaning against the oat plants, and the oat plants were holding them. The interlocking structure that Nora had described from the Wageningen research was doing exactly what the research said it would do. The field looked like a field that had been through a storm. The rest of the farm looked like a field that had lost. Harlan stood at the edge of the south field for a long time. He is not a man who shows a great deal of emotion, by the account of everyone who knows him. But the people who were at the co-op 2 days later, when he came in to settle his account, said that he looked different. Not happy, exactly. The damage to the rest of the farm was real, and the financial consequences were real, and there was nothing to be happy about. But he looked like a man who had learned something important, and who was still in the process of deciding what it meant. Let me tell you about what the harvest numbers showed, because the numbers are where the story stops being about a feeling and starts being about a fact. The pure wheat stands on the Tesdall farm. The 450 acres that had lodged came in at 31 bushels per acre. The county average that year for farms that had experienced significant lodging was 29 bushels per acre. The quality discounts at the elevator, because lodged wheat molds and sprouts and loses test weight, took another $18 per acre off the effective price. The combined effect of yield loss and quality discount put the pure wheat ground at roughly $112 per acre in net revenue against a 5-year average of $187 per acre. That was a $75 per acre loss against the baseline. Across 450 acres, that was $33,750 that did not exist. The south field, the 30 acres of mixed wheat and oats, came in at 38 bushels of wheat per acre and 22 bushels of oats per acre. The wheat yield was slightly below the farm's 5-year average, which was consistent with the small yield penalty the Iowa State trials had predicted. The oat yield was sold at a premium to a specialty grain buyer in Cedar Rapids, who was supplying a regional milling operation, and the blended revenue per acre for the mixed stand came to $194. Against the same 5-year baseline of $187 per acre, the South Field had essentially performed at its historical average in a year when the rest of the farm had lost a third of its revenue. Nora was back in Ames when the harvest came in. Her father called her on a Wednesday evening in late July and read her the numbers over the phone. There was a pause. Then he said, "You were right." Nora said she was glad the field held. Harlan said, "I want to talk about the fall rotation before you go back for your senior year." That was not a small thing. In 31 years of farming, Harlan Tesdall had never asked anyone outside his own head about the fall rotation. The rotation was his. It was the expression of his knowledge and his judgment and his relationship with his land. To invite his daughter into that conversation was not a gesture. It was a transfer of authority, offered quietly, without ceremony, the way the most important things in farming families tend to happen. Nora drove home the following weekend. They sat at the kitchen table again, and this time Harlan had pulled his own yield records and his own soil maps, and he spread them on the table alongside Nora's legal pad, and they talked for 3 hours. By the end of the evening, they had agreed to expand the mixed stand to 120 acres in the fall. The south field, the 2 low-lying blocks on the west side, and a strip along the creek bottom that had been Harlan's worst-performing ground for a decade. Diane brought coffee twice and did not say anything, but she was smiling. Let me tell you about what happened at the co-op that fall, because the co-op is where public opinion in Hardin County is formed and where it changes. The October meeting, the second Tuesday, Dale Crowley's informal court, was attended by more farmers than usual. The storm had been the defining event of the season, and the losses were fresh, and people wanted to talk about it. Dale was at the counter with his usual group, and the conversation moved through the obvious topics: crop insurance claims, the elevator's discount schedule, whether the Extension Service was going to put together a lodging management workshop for the following year. Someone mentioned the Tesdall South Field, not accusatorially, just as a fact that had been noticed. Several farmers had driven past it in the days after the storm and had seen that it was standing when everything around it was down, and word had gotten around the way word gets around in a county of 18,000 people, where everyone knows everyone's ground. Dale Crowley said, "I heard about that." He said it carefully. One of the farmers, a younger man named Owen Briggs, who had 300 acres on the north side of the county, asked what had been different about that field. Dale said Harlan's daughter had put oats in with the wheat. There was a pause. Owen Briggs said, "The mixed stand thing." Dale said, "Yes." Owen said, "You know about that?" Dale said, "She mentioned it to me in the spring." He paused. He said, "I told her it wasn't how we do things here. The room was quiet in a way that rooms in small communities get quiet when something has been said that everyone is going to remember. Not hostile, not triumphant, just quiet, in the way of people absorbing a fact that changes the shape of something they thought they understood." Dale Crowley is not a man who processes things quickly in public. He is a man who processes things carefully in private, and then acts on what he's concluded. He did not say anything else about Nora Tesdall that morning. He settled his business and drove back to his office and sat at his desk for a while. 2 weeks later, he drove out to the Tesdall farm. Harlan was in the machine shed when Dale pulled in. They shook hands and talked for a few minutes about the crop insurance process and the elevator's final discount schedule. Then Dale asked if Nora was around. Harlan said she was back in Ames finishing her senior year. He said he could give him her number. Dale said he'd appreciate that. Let me tell you about the phone call Dale Crowley made to Nora Tesdall in November of 2019, because it is the kind of phone call that doesn't happen often and means more than the words in it. Nora was in the library at Iowa State when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered it, and Dale Crowley introduced himself and said he was calling because he wanted to understand what she'd done on the South Field and why it worked the way it worked. He said he'd been the extension agent in Hardin County for 19 years, and he thought he knew the ground there as well as anyone, and he was finding it necessary to revise that assessment. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Crowley, you told me in May that I was going to confuse my combine operator and cut my yield and explain myself to my father at harvest time." Dale said, "Yes." He said, "I did say that." Nora said, "The combine operator figured it out. The yield on the mixed stand came in above the farm's 5-year average, and my father asked me to come home and plan the fall rotation with him." Dale said, "I know." He said, "I'm not calling to argue. I'm calling because I have 47 farms in this county, and most of them lost between a quarter and a third of their wheat revenue this year. And if what you did on those 30 acres can be replicated across the county, I need to understand it well enough to explain it to people who are going to ask me the same questions I told you to stop asking. There was a pause. Nora said, I can send you the Wageningen papers and the Iowa State trial data. She said, Dr. Hendricks at Iowa State would probably be willing to do a field day in the county next spring if the Extension office wanted to host one. Dale said that would be useful. Nora said, one more thing. She said, the lesson isn't that oats are better than wheat. She said, the lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail. Dale Crowley did not respond immediately. When he did, he said, I'll write that down. He did write it down. Nora found out later from her father that Dale had put it on a note card and taped it to the wall above his desk. Let me tell you about the spring of 2020, because that is when the story stopped being about one family and started being about a county. Dale Crowley organized a field day in partnership with Iowa State Extension in April of 2020. Dr. Hendricks drove up from Ames with 2 graduate students and a set of presentation materials and spent a morning walking Hardin County farmers through the science of mixed stands, lodging mechanics, and the trial data from Story County and the Netherlands. The event was held at the Testel Farm, in the South Field, which Harlan had kept in the mixed stand and which was already showing the early season canopy structure that the research described. 31 farmers attended. That was a significant number for a county extension event on a weekday morning. Dale Crowley introduced Dr. Hendricks. He did not introduce Nora, who was standing at the edge of the group in a Carhartt jacket and a seed cap that had replaced the Iowa State sweatshirt she'd been wearing the year before. He probably should have. But the farmers who had driven past the South Field in October knew whose idea it was, and several of them made a point of finding her after the formal presentation and asking her questions directly. Owen Briggs asked her how she'd worked out the seeding rates. She told him. He wrote it down in a notebook. A farmer named Isaac Johansson, who had 600 acres on the west side of the county and had lost more wheat revenue in the storm than almost anyone, asked her what she thought about applying the approach to his low-lying ground near the drainage ditch. She walked him through the soil considerations for 20 minutes. He nodded throughout and asked careful questions and at the end said, I should have talked to you in the spring. She said, You're talking to me now. Dale Crowley watched these conversations from across the field. He did not interrupt them. By the fall of 2020, 11 farms in Hardin County had planted mixed wheat oat stands on portions of their acreage. The total acreage was 847 acres, spread across the county's lowest lying and historically most lodging-prone ground. The yields that fall were not dramatic. 2020 was a mild year with no significant wind events during grain fill, and the pure wheat stands performed well, and the mixed stands performed slightly below the pure wheat stands on a per-acre wheat basis, which was exactly what the research predicted. Several of the farmers who had tried it noted the result and decided to wait and see. The farmers who waited got their answer in the summer of 2022. Let me tell you about the summer of 2022, because 2022 was the year that settled the question for everyone who still had one. The spring of 2022 was wet. Not catastrophically wet, no flooding, no prevented planting, but persistently, relentlessly wet, in the way that Iowa springs sometimes are, with rain every 4 or 5 days from mid-April through early June. The wheat came up strong and tall. By late June, the county was looking at what the elevator manager called a banner crop. The stems were long, the heads were heavy, the test weight was projecting well. Dale Crowley told the farmers at the June co-op meeting that if the weather held through July, they were looking at the best wheat harvest in a decade. The weather did not hold through July. On the night of July 8th, a derecho, a line of severe thunderstorms with embedded straight-line winds, moved across central Iowa. The National Weather Service recorded sustained winds of 68 miles per hour at the Iowa Falls Station, with gusts to 81. The storm lasted 90 minutes in Hardin County. By the time it was over, the damage to the wheat crop was not a matter of degrees. It was nearly total. Fields that had been projecting 58 and 60 bushels per acre were, by the following morning, lying flat on the ground. The county extension office received 140 calls in the first 48 hours. The crop insurance adjusters were in the county within a week. The final county-wide average yield for winter wheat in Hardin County in 2022 was 22 bushels per acre. The 5-year average had been 51 bushels per acre. The quality discounts at the elevator, because the lodged wheat had been rained on twice more after the storm before it could be harvested, averaged $24 per acre. The net revenue per acre for the county's wheat ground in 2022 was approximately $89, against a 5-year average of $201. The total estimated revenue loss for the county's wheat farmers against their historical baseline was in excess of $4.2 million. The farms that had mixed stands fared differently. The 847 acres of mixed wheat-oat ground in the county experienced lodging rates of between 15 and 40%, depending on the density of the oat component and the specific wind exposure of each field. The Tesdall farm, which now had 120 acres in the mixed stand, experienced lodging on approximately 18% of that acreage, concentrated in the exposed corners and edges. The 82% that remained standing yielded an average of 44 bushels of wheat per acre and 19 bushels of oats per acre. The blended revenue, after the oat premium from the Cedar Rapids buyer, was $178 per acre. Against the county's $89 per acre, the mixed stand ground had earned exactly twice as much. Against the 5-year baseline of $201, it had lost ground, but it had not been broken. The difference between losing some ground and being broken is, in farming, the difference between a hard year and a crisis. Harlan Tesdall's 120 mixed stand acres earned $21,360 in a year, when his 360 acres of pure wheat earned $32,040. If the mixed stand had been pure wheat, it would have earned approximately $10,680. The mixed stand had, in the worst wind year in a decade, earned him an additional $10,680 that did not exist in the traditional approach. That money paid the note on the combine. That money was the difference between a year that was hard and a year that required a conversation with the bank. Nora was not in Iowa in July of 2022. She had graduated from Iowa State the previous spring and had taken a position as an agronomist with a consulting firm in Ames that worked with farms across central Iowa. She heard about the derecho from her father on the phone the morning after it happened. He told her the south field was standing. He told her the numbers he was projecting. He said, "I've been thinking about what you told me 3 years ago, and I want to ask you something." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "What's next?" Nora was quiet for a moment. She said, "I've been reading about cover crop integration with winter wheat. Crimson clover undersown at heading, terminated before harvest. It adds nitrogen, improves soil organic matter, and the preliminary data from the Missouri trials suggests it reduces input costs enough to offset the establishment cost within 2 seasons." Harlan said, Bring the papers when you come home for Thanksgiving." Nora said she would. Let me tell you about what Dale Crowley did in the fall of 2022, because it is the part of this story that matters most, and that is the hardest to tell. In September of 2022, 2 months after the derecho, Dale Crowley drove to the consulting firm in Ames where Nora Tesdall worked. He had called ahead. He came in the morning, and they sat in a small conference room, and he had a notepad and a list of questions. He was not there to apologize. He was not there to perform contrition. He was there because he had 47 farms in Hardin County that had just lost, collectively, more than $4 million in revenue, and because he was an extension agent whose job was to help farmers make better decisions, and because he had, in May of 2019, told a 22-year-old woman with a legal pad full of correct data to go plant her father's wheat and let the oats go. He said, "I want to understand what you know that I didn't know in 2019. Nora looked at him across the table. She said, "Mr. Crowley, you told me that you'd never seen a Hardin County farmer who needed oats to prop up his wheat." Dale said, "Yes." She said, "You'd been the extension agent for 19 years without a derecho." The record looked clean because the disaster hadn't happened yet. The disaster was always possible. The research said it was possible. The question was whether the absence of a disaster in your experience was evidence that the disaster wasn't coming, or just evidence that it hadn't come yet. Dale said, "I understand the distinction now." Nora said, "The farmers who put in mixed stands in 2020, the 11 farms, the 847 acres, they came through 2022 at twice the revenue of the county average." She said, "The farmers who didn't try it because the 2020 season was mild and the pure wheat did fine, they're the ones calling the crop insurance adjusters right now." Dale said, "I know." She said, "The lesson isn't that mixed stands are right for every acre on every farm and every year." She said, "The lesson is that any system that has never been tested by the worst possible conditions isn't a system. It's a streak of good luck. And the farmers who understood that before 2022 are the ones who have options right now. The ones who didn't understand it are the ones who are hoping their crop insurance covers the gap." Dale Crowley wrote that down too. Over the following 2 years, Dale Crowley incorporated mixed stand management into his county extension programming as a standard component of winter wheat production guidance. He partnered with Dr. Hendricks on a multi-county trial that expanded the Iowa State data set to include Hardin, Chickasaw, and Tama counties. He presented the results at the Iowa Extension Annual Conference in Des Moines in 2023, and in that presentation he cited, by name, the work Nora Tesdall had done on her father's South Field in 2019 as the practical demonstration that had preceded the formal research and made the case in terms that farmers could see and touch and measure. Nora was in the audience. Her father was sitting next to her. When Dale said her name, Harlan Tesdall put his hand on his daughter's arm, briefly, and then took it away. He did not say anything. He did not need to. By the fall of 2024, 63 farms in Hardin County had planted some portion of their acreage in mixed wheat-oat stands. The total acreage was just over 9,400 acres, representing roughly 14% of the county's winter wheat ground. It was not a revolution. It was a beginning. Dale Crowley said, at a co-op meeting that fall, that he expected the number to be 20% within 3 years, and that the Extension Office was working on seeding rate recommendations specific to Hardin County soil types that would be available the following spring. Owen Briggs, who had expanded his mixed stand to 80 acres and had come through 2022 better than almost anyone on the north side of the county, asked Dale where he'd gotten the original idea. Dale said, from a farmer's daughter who was smarter than I was and patient enough to wait for me to figure it out. Let me tell you about Nora Tesdall in the fall of 2024, because she is not the same person who sat at her father's kitchen table with a yellow legal pad in April of 2019, and the difference is worth describing. She is 27 years old. She's been working as an agronomist for 3 years, and she has 60 farm clients across 4 counties in central Iowa. She drives a truck that has 140,000 miles on it, and a back seat full of soil sample bags and printed research papers and a Carhartt jacket that has seen enough seasons to have its own story. She still keeps a yellow legal pad in the passenger seat, though the notes on it now are her own data from her own clients, rather than tables she copied from journal articles in a university library. Her father's farm is doing well. The 120 acres of mixed stand have been expanded in stages to 200 acres. The remaining 280 acres rotate between winter wheat, soybeans, and a cover crop mix that Nora designed and that has been improving the soil organic matter on the farm's most compacted ground for 3 consecutive years. The south field by the creek, the 30 acres where it started, yields more consistently now than it has in a generation. Harlan Tesdall is 61 years old. He still farms every acre himself, with occasional help from a neighbor during harvest. He is not a man who talks about his daughter's work in terms that would embarrass either of them. But he has, in the last 2 years, started attending the extension field days that Dale Crowley organizes, which he did not do before 2019. He stands in the back of the group and listens. Sometimes Nora is presenting. When she is, he stands in the same place he always stands, at the back, with his arms at his sides, and he listens to his daughter explain things to rooms full of farmers who are writing her words down in notebooks. Last Thanksgiving, Nora came home and they sat at the kitchen table again. She had papers with her, as she always does. She had been reading about precision fermentation-derived nitrogen sources, a technology still mostly at the research stage, but with a handful of commercial pilots in the Midwest showing cost reductions in synthetic nitrogen application that the conventional fertilizer market had not yet priced in. She thought it might be relevant to the cover crop integration work they were already doing. She thought the farm might be positioned, in 3 or 4 years, to reduce its synthetic nitrogen inputs by 30 to 40% without yield penalty. Harlan listened to all of it. He looked at the papers. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. Not. I need to think about it. Not. Let's start with 30 acres. Just, yes." Diane brought coffee. Nobody said anything for a while. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end at the kitchen table, and it doesn't end with a county extension presentation, and it doesn't end with a number on a yield report, however satisfying that number might be. The note card that Dale Crowley taped above his desk in the fall of 2019 is still there. The tape has yellowed and one corner has come loose and been restuck with a newer piece. The handwriting on it is his, in blue ballpoint, and it says, "Any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail." He has shown it to every new extension agent he has mentored since 2020. He has quoted it in 3 conference presentations. He told Nora about it when she came to Ames in 2022, and she said she was glad it was useful, and he said it was the most useful thing on his wall. The South Field in Hardin County is planted this fall, as it has been every fall since 2019, in mixed winter wheat and oats. The stand is denser than the fields around it, and the texture of it is different, and if you walk it in late June when the oat plants are filling in between the wheat stems, you can see the structure of it, the way the 2 crops lean against each other. the way the whole stand is more than the sum of its parts. It is 30 acres on the east side of Hardin County that most people drive past without stopping. But the farmers who know the story slow down when they pass it. Nora Tesdall planted oats in a wheat county. They laughed. The derecho came, the wheat died, the mixed stand lived, and the south field is still standing.